Now the pen tool has a few more options. By default, you have to click and drag in order to see a preview. And by default, the line is pretty thin. Whoops. Let me click on that. There we go. So as you can see, it can be a little tricky to figure out where you are and what you're doing. Now, this can be fixed by going to the pen tool, and then up in your toolbars up here, you have a gear icon. Now this gives you some path options, one of which is rubber banding. This is on by default inside of Illustrator, and all it means is once you've clicked, without clicking and dragging, you get a preview of the line and where you're going. Holding down spacebar, by the way, allows you to move a point after you've placed it. So I haven't let go of my mouse yet. Spacebar allows me to change that. Hold down the Alt key. You'll see this little V, upside down V occur. That will let me break it. It's the same thing as using the Convert Point tool. Let me continue where I left off. I'll just click on the last point there. But with this rubber banding on, I can very easily go in and do these adjustments and see exactly how it's going to be, or once I've completed it, which is very, very useful. Now, if you don't like it, you can turn it off. For this demonstration too, I normally recommend the default thickness of 1 pixel, but just to show you a little bit better, I crank this up to 3 pixels for a minute. You can really see the line. Hold down the Alt key and click on the previous point. That will allow me to break the curvature so that I can do things like go in other directions. Hold down spacebar so I can move the points around. Alt key click. Oops. And let me just draw that. So you can see I can very quickly go in and cover a large area with the path. You got to hold down the Alt key to break up the earlier ones. Now, if you wanted to have some help with what you were doing, you don't have to use the standard pen tool. You can also use the freeform pen tool. It has an option called magnetic. Well, here it is without magnetic. If you have something like a touch screen or a pen tablet, you can quickly just draw a shape and it will create the shape. Simple. By turning on magnetic, it will allow me to have this act as a magnetic lasso tool. It will follow the thresholds, and it does it pretty well. So if you're in a hurry, this can sometimes be, double click to close it, be a quick way to do it. But notice that it's not always 100% accurate. This missed quite badly. So there are times when this is useful, but it's also a bit of a trick because you really still need to go into it and make further adjustments by taking the original pen tool, clicking to add, moving your points around and adjusting things. I often don't use it because just using the pen tool and practicing a little bit will result in more controlled edges, which is really what you're after. So there are a few more things to note in the option bar up here. By default, you'll be creating a shape rather than a path. Now, a shape means that it has things like a stroke and a fill. And when you create it, it will generally be set to new layer, so you end up with a new shape layer. Now, and there's this box that has some drop downs. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Let me clear this out. Okay, let's get just the pen again and make a path instead. Notice we have no paths. Notice we have the 1 layer. Now on shape, it would create a new shape layer. With path, it simply creates the path. That means that it's only stored temporarily in your working path. And as you build on, you're building a progressively more complicated set of working paths, but they're still just stored there. So if you want to save this, if I were to click off, for example, it's gone, and my work path is currently still there, and I can bring it up and with the pen, here we are, I can bring it back up, but it's a little harder to understand where it is. It's also possible to accidentally delete it when you start working with some of the other shapes, depending on the version of Photoshop you're in. So at this point, you'd want to go in and click on your create new path icon, and then you have your path stored. You can throw away the work path and it's fine. I can load this back in as a mask or what have you. I'm sorry, I did that wrong. Let me step back. Don't click on the Don't just click on the create new path. You want to drag it to the create new path, and that will store it. Otherwise, you just create a blank path. There we go. So now if I start again, within the path, it will be added to it. And notice when I click off of the pen tool now, it's still visible because the path is still there. It's still active. All right. And if I click off of the active path, then it disappears. If I grab the pen, boom, it's back. So I've got the path. I think this is an inconvenient way to work. I think it's a convenient way to store things. So in other words, I prefer to start with a shape, create a shape, however I like the shape. And then once I'm done with it being a shape layer, come into path, drag it down to the new icon, the new path icon, boom, I've got it stored cleanly. I don't have to look at it or think about it anymore. It's just there. So I can click to a different tool and voila, life is good. And it's stored. I can call it back up later. So that's how I tend to handle this. I work in a shape, I store as a path. Because rarely do I need the shape inside of Photoshop. Those tend to be very computationally expensive, so you'll see your computer slowing down. All right. Woo, so there's that, but there's more. Let's go back to shape for a moment. Remember how I said that it can create a new layer? You also have the option of combining shapes, subtracting front shape, intersecting shape area, or excluding overlapping shapes. You can also merge shape components. Now let's see if my copy of Photoshop will behave and not crash as I do this. I'm going to just create a shape. So I've got the shape. Now, instead of a new layer, I'm going to combine layers. And I create another shape. Notice I didn't get a new shape layer. Now that I'm combining these, I can draw as many as I want, and we'll just keep piling them on top of one another. Now, instead of combining, if I were to subtract the active one, you can see how it removes everything from it. It's like it's an eraser, except it's still, of course, editable. If I go into my direct select tool, you can see everything still in there. So I can move it around to do those edits. I can also intersect so that only the areas that overlap on the intersecting one on top show up. Now I said on top, I'll come back to that. Exclude overlapping shapes. So now where they all overlap, they disappear. And then if I'm happy with it, I can merge the shape components and I get one very complicated path. Let me undo that. There we go. Now, I mentioned that you have an above and below. And what that means is that there's a stacking order, much like the Puppet Warp tool and its pins. So when you have a shape selected that's in a multiple path shape, you can move it around by going to this little stack icon on the top of your options bar and do things like send the shape to the back, bring the shape to the front, send the shape backward, and that's just moving it up and down. But without something like a layers palette or menu, it's a little difficult to remember where everything is, so you'll need to play around with that for a bit. You can also select multiple paths and use the align options that are available to you to try to force things together and, you know, hope for the best. It's going to do its best guess on a lot of these, and frequently it's a pretty good bet that it will get it right. You can also do distributions if you have multiple shapes inside the layer rather than this one big compounded shape that I have going on here. I believe I made it a compound. Oh, I had not actually. Well, that's interesting. Merge shape components, and then it's one big compound shape. So if I were to have two of these, I'm going to alt drag them. I should be able to control the distribution, but I would need to do it to the canvas, and it looks like I don't have it for some reason. Just a second. All right, it appears that in my specific version of Photoshop, the distribute does not in fact work correctly. I would need to update to the next version for that to work. Essentially, what distribute will do if you are fully updated, or, well, let me put it this way. If you're on some versions of Photoshop, to use distribute, you're going to have to duplicate rasterized layers and then you can distribute them. That has always been the case. If you want to use it for paths, though, you duplicate non-rasterized layers, use Shift, click to select them. Like if you had 2 of them, grab them both, shift click. Then that would allow you to use the distribute settings to either the canvas or the selection. If it's on selection, you control A and then that would unlock it. Again, my version won't do it. On the most recent version, which has yet a new update, yet again, that I'll need to update to, the distribute will work as with every other program on the planet. Simply clicking it will take the canvas size by default and then move your object to either the center or the left or what have you. That's what the distribute will do. Unfortunately, I can't demonstrate it in this one specific version of Photoshop. So if you're having issues with your version of 2019 on Photoshop, update it and that should go away. Since I'm in the middle of recording videos, I can't do that. So sorry about that. Essentially, distribute will work the same as every other program on the planet. Maybe later with some rasterized layers, we'll go over distributing things. But for now, that's how the path would do it. All right, so there's one more tool under the pen tool, which is the curvature pen. And let me reset some things. I want it to create a new layer. Excellent. And in fact, I don't need this anymore, so just get rid of that. Oops. So with the curvature tool, as you click, it will automatically have curves, and that's it. So it's just a quick way to kind of get curved objects out. There's not too much more to it. You can do some of the same tricks as before, or at least you should be able to. Though as you've seen with my version of Photoshop, it's not necessarily the most stable with your pen tool, so do watch out for that. And grab that again. All right, so if I click, I see it has some issues figuring out the rubber banding. I should be able to move around my image with spacebar. If I click and drag, I can change the shape of the curve until it's where I want it to be. If I alt-click, I can have points. And then there we go. That's about all there is to the curvature tool. Now, honestly, just the pen tool by itself is probably all you'll need. The default auto add delete will allow you to add the points, the anchor points, and delete them. It's very, very useful. All right, I will show you how to store things and load things using the path panel, the path palette or path window next. So I hope to see you in the next video.